On a snow-stilled night, a German shepherd with warm amber coat sits unmoving at a church door, staring at the wall as if it could breathe. Officer Evan thinks it's coincidence until the dog won't leave, guiding him to a locked steel hatch and the faintest sound beneath. What follows is a race through forgotten basements and shuttered warehouses where every bark is a signal and every second holds a life. This is a true-hearted story of instinct, courage, and the bond that turns a dog into a compass for hope. What did he sense, and who was waiting in the dark? The sound arrived first, a thin metallic clatter, a tremor of coin on steel. Then a smear of movement behind the seam of a door that should have slept forever. And Evan Cole felt the cold rise across his skin as Shadow the German shepherd, with a warm amber coat and sable shading along his back, leaned hard into the lead and pinned his gaze to the foundation wall of St. Mark's. He raised 2 fingers, the perimeter sealed like a zipper. Sirens stayed dark, and he laid his palm to the steel and felt heat that had no business living in winter. Lock it down. Soft voices. Long angles, he said, and Boots-adjusted beams found brick instead of air. Lena Park slid left to cover the loading nook, while Sergeant Nolan Hart posted 2 in the alley behind the rectory, their shapes folding into the old stone. Shadow's tail went still. Ears sharp, eyes bright, every line of him pointing at the door. The way compasses settle on truth and through the metal. Evan felt a second smaller shiver, a story told in scratches and patience, that said someone had touched the lock moments ago and believed secrecy could pass for safety. He steadied his breath, because steadiness multiplies across teams, and spoke to the steel as if speech could cross it, promising blankets and light and names. Then paused, listening for the arithmetic of knocks, and when 2 faint taps answered with a breath between them that felt like hope remembering its job. He kept the door closed just for a beat longer to buy the room enough quiet to do the work right, then eased the key, let the seal exhale and open space enough for a yellow tongue of light to taste the stair. Only then did his mind play the reel of the mornings that led him here the first day he saw the shepherd, sitting statue still at the front steps while parishioners crossed with scarves and paper cups. The second day when the posture repeated the third, when the dog shifted a few feet to align with the side aisle, that small geometric correction that felt like a sentence spoken without words. A clear insistence that meaning lived along the north wall, rather than the grand doors. Evan Park approached with open hands, saw the simple collar smelled clean fur, watched intelligent eyes, and when he angled his shoulders toward the transept, the dog stood mirrored him, and sat again, gaze drilled through stone. Inside, Pastor Whitaker, gentle mouth, wintered eyes walked him through the building that hides beneath hymns, cameras rolling on motion with 30 days, retained an interior panel in the admin hall that conceals the stair. They actually use a western exterior access that a predecessor had sealed for good. When coal rooms gave way to gas, a ring of keys split between a safe here and a building manager's sun-chasing in Arizona. The pastor's voice carried both pride and a thin seam of discomfort, the kind that comes with inheritance, and Evan filed the details the way carpenters file measurements that make walls plumb. Hart preferred warrants and perfect paperwork. Evan preferred conversations that left rooms intact. They split the difference with a walk of the sanctuary, a study of vents and baseboards, a look for corners where secrets like to nest, and then Shadow drew a taut straight line toward the foundation trench. Nose to the steel shoulders forward, as if the earth exhaled a single instruction only he could smell. Up close, the door looked newer than its context. Hardware clean paint unscuffed by salted boots, a secret that practiced being ordinary. Now in the present, the hinge took weight, the gap widened, the light slid across raw concrete, and a stair that broke left. An air rolled out, metal old dust, a ghost of bleach. Something human. Evan kept the beam low to preserve eyes and trust. Named himself and his team, promised measured movement, invited agency, offered water and warmth and time. And then he heard breathing, plural and careful, the kind that stays quiet to avoid attention. and he felt the old tug to rush the movie urge to save everything with speed and let it pass because patience saves people who have lived too long inside other people's decisions. "Fellowship Hall for triage," he said to Whitaker, who was already moving the kindness around his mouth, hardening into purpose. "Engines and lights off," he told EMS. "Strong shoulders on the landing," he told Hart, "and eyes on the rectory windows in case anyone makes for an opposite door." Lena gathered mylar blankets, her voice tuned to the frequency that bodies believe, while Shadow held the top step, a bronze statue of attention, granting caution and permission in the same breath. They took the stairs in a patient rhythm, speaking the kind of sentences that lay a bridge over fear. And the room at the bottom assembled itself under the light pillars and ducts and pallets. A rolled carpet, a workbench under a bulletin board with a pale rectangle where paper had once hung. 2 bright pins, still biting cork. A curl of red fiber snagged on steel. The architecture of a plan removed in a hurry. Faces found themselves in the beam. Eyes pinched small cheekbones sharp from air without sun. Then lengthened into people when Lena crouched and offered a blanket. When Evan offered a forearm to grip rather than a hand to pull. When Hart's officers cleared a path from cold to warmth. With the quiet competence of old winter towns. The woman who first found her voice wore her hair braided tight against her skull. She tested her legs, breathed once through the effort, and thanked them, that soft please and thank you that restores order to the air. One by one, the cluster became a line on the stairs, and then a series of small arrivals in the hall above, where Whitaker and 3 volunteers, summoned by texts and trust, had laid towels, paper cups, clementines, socks, and a privacy born of common sense, a gentleness with edges, the practical mercy of civic life, done well. When the last of the room had climbed, Evan stood for a moment with the dust and the pins and the pale rectangle hands, away from surfaces to preserve prints and let the room confess what rooms always confess once bodies leave. What remained was a skeleton of habit, a path from here to somewhere else. A rhythm of use that said the door upstairs had never been retired, only rebranded. Above him, Shadow's silhouette waited at the lip of the stair, ears tipped down, listening with his whole self as if hearing belonged to the spine, and that sight steadied Evan, the way a horizon steadies a sailor. He climbed wood rails smooth under his palm from years of practice, accepted from Shadow the brief touch of a nose at his shoulder, and stepped into the fellowship hall where warmth worked its blunt miracles. EMS murmured. Hart returned from the alley with a small nod that unknotted shoulders. Whitaker moved from table to table like a farmer tending a late frost, and Lena handed a cup to a teenager whose eyes had done too much work and needed permission to rest. Evan gathered that quiet, let it sit in his lungs, and then walked the short corridor back to the side door to touch the steel again, feeling only honest cold now, a blank slate that still remembered heat. He filmed the hardware and the threshold, narrated dates and names for the record, logged the decisions that had turned fear into movement without violence, and signed the scene over to the morning with the kind of care that leaves space for the next hour to bring new truths. He did not promise happy endings to anyone, because promises like that dissolve on contact with reality, yet he said something better, something true. You're safe. You're warm. We're here. And watched the words put weight under feet and color back into faces. Outside, the sky thinned toward silver, a hint that the day would accept them. Shadow sat in the spot where Evan first noticed him days ago. The same quiet posture, the same unblinking attention, as if he had been holding the line while the town figured out how to follow. Hart traced a finger along the foundation and said they would need warrants, plans, invoices, permits, everything paper can give. Evan agreed and pictured the pale rectangle on the cork, the missing page, with its points and lines, the kind of page that says here and here and here. To anyone willing to believe maps can hide in plain sight. He flattened his palm to the steel once more, then let it go. Warmth no longer lived there, but the idea of warmth lingered like an aftertaste. A reminder that below the hymn book world, another world had been breathing, and that the shepherd with amber fur and steady eyes had understood this before any of them. The town would learn what every hinge knows, that doors declared sealed forever can still swing, and Evan felt the small internal click of a decision settle. Hooked to the coming work, he looked at Shadow and saw in the dog's calm, forward gaze a sentence written without grammar. The basement called closed had been used, people had passed, and the one who kept vigil had known it from the start. The first sweep of the ground floor gave them nothing. No stairwell tucked behind utility closets, no hatch beneath the worn carpet in the vestry, no service corridor that hinted at going down. The church smelled of candle wax and radiator heat, old hymnals and polished wood. But nowhere did the air shift the way it does near a hidden descent. Evan Cole moved slowly, his boots finding the center of each aisle board, scanning the corners where shadows looked thicker than they should be. He could feel Shadow's leash, taut with concentration. The German Shepherd pulling toward the north wall again and again, only to be blocked by uninterrupted paneling. He knew the dog wasn't wrong, he had learned that in the last 24 hours. If Shadow insisted, there was something to find. Pastor Whitaker followed the patrol's quiet progression, his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes avoided the far corner of the administrative hallway. Evan caught the flicker and stopped walking. "Pastor," he said evenly, "if there's a way down, now's the time to tell me." Whitaker hesitated, then sighed, the breath of a man conceding a truth he wished had stayed buried. "There is a door," he admitted. It was disguised years ago, paneled over to match the wall. "We keep it locked. There's no reason for anyone to use it." Evan nodded once. "Show me." The pastor led them to a section of wall between a filing cabinet and a coat rack. Up close, the paint was fractionally lighter, the grain of the wood vertical instead of horizontal. Whitaker took a key from his ring, turned it in a barely visible lock, and pulled. A narrow wooden door swung outward with the reluctant creak of long disuse, revealing a steep stair that dropped into cold air. Shadow's nose dipped into the gap, inhaling deep, his body leaning forward with certainty. He looked back at Evan, as if to say, "Here, this is where they went." "Flashlights low," Evan ordered. Lena Park moved in beside him, beam pointed toward the first steps. The air from below was stale, touched with metal, and something faintly chemical. They descended into a rectangular room. The walls raw stone, the ceiling threaded with old pipes. In the center sat a hatch, flat steel with a recessed handle. Dust lay undisturbed on the floor around it, but the handle itself gleamed faintly in the light, as though touched within the last day. Shadow circled once, then placed both front paws on the hatch, pressed to the seam-tail stiff. Evan crouched, fingertips grazing the cold metal. "We open it," he said. Two officers braced on either side and pulled. The hatch lifted with a reluctant scrape, revealing a ladder bolted into the wall. A shaft of light from above spilled down onto the faces that turned upward from the space below, faces pale and blinking hands, shielding eyes unused to brightness. The first woman to speak did so in a whisper, her voice hoarse. "Are you police?" "Yes," Evan said, steady and clear. "You're safe now." They brought the survivors up slowly, each one wrapped in a mylar blanket Lena fetched from the supply kit. Some could walk. Others had to be supported. The room above became a temporary haven. Water bottles opened words of reassurance spoken in low tones. Only when everyone was accounted for did Evan turn his attention back to the basement. Along one wall, behind a folding table stacked with canned goods, he found a flat file cabinet. Most drawers were empty, but the bottom one stuck halfway, before giving way as if something had been wedged deep inside. He reached in and pulled out a roll of heavy paper bound with twine. On the workbench, under the beam of his flashlight, the paper unfurled into a map, thick stock creased from use edges darkened by hands. It was a street map of the county annotated in ballpoint and red marker. 10 crimson X's stood out like wounds. One marked the church itself. Another sat over a location Evan recognized instantly, the old Ashland warehouse district. Hart leaned over his shoulder. You seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah, Evan said. If these marks are what I think they are, this wasn't just a one-site operation. Lena snapped photos from multiple angles, careful to include the hand-drawn notes in the margins, dates, times, and what looked like initials. None of it was in order, but the pattern felt deliberate. Why keep this here? Hart asked. Evan thought of the disguised door upstairs, the steel hatch below, the faint warmth on metal from the night before. Because whoever ran this needed a central point, and maybe because they thought no one would ever look. He traced a line between the church and the Ashland warehouse. The route crossed a service road behind the freight yard, a place with enough noise and movement to hide anything. The other X's scattered outward, some in town, others in the rural fringe, where barns rotted and no one asked questions. Whitaker stood a few steps back, his expression grave. I had no idea, he said quietly. I swear to you, Officer Cole, I didn't know this was here. Evan met his eyes and believed him. The pastor's shock had weight to it, the kind you can't fake. We'll need your cooperation going forward. Access to the building keys to every lock and any records that might show who had reason to be here at odd hours. Of course. Hart was already on the radio, requesting additional units and a forensics team. Lena folded the map carefully into an evidence bag. Shadow, meanwhile, was pacing in front of the ladder, as if reluctant to leave the space beneath. His gaze flicked to Evan, waiting for the next instruction. We're going to Ashland next, Evan said. Hart glanced up from his call. We splitting the teams? We have to, Evan replied. There are 8 other marks on this map we haven't touched. We don't know how much time we have before someone decides to move or erase what's left. You take half the unit and hit the nearest rural site. Lena and I will take Shadow to the warehouse. Hart nodded, already shifting into logistics. We'll need comms on a dedicated channel. If one team finds something, the others can reroute. Do it. Whitaker offered them the fellowship hall for staging. Within minutes, the survivors were moved there, wrapped in blankets, given tea and the first real warmth they'd had in who knows how long. A medic checked each one, noting injuries and dehydration. Evan stayed just long enough to see the fear begin to drain from their faces. Back in the basement, the forensics team photographed every surface, hinges, ladder rungs, the concrete floor beneath the hatch. They dusted for prints, bagged scraps of fabric, scraped trace from the hatch handle. One tech pointed out a faint footprint on the ladder's lowest rung, the tread fresh enough to have been made in the last day or two. Evan kept his focus on the map. The 8 remaining X's weren't random. They formed a loose circle around the center of the county like spokes on a wheel. If the church was the hub, the rest were drop points. He marked the order in which they'd be hit: Ashland first, then the closest rural site, then the others in sequence. Every minute mattered now. Whoever had made those marks would know something had gone wrong as soon as they found the church empty. When the last evidence bag was sealed, Evan gave Shadow a brief scratch behind the ear. You found them, he murmured. The dog's tail gave one slow wag before settling again. Upstairs, Hart was handing out assignments. 4 officers to rural Site 1, 3 to Site 2. Lena would ride with Evan. 2 more cars would sweep the outer perimeter for any sign of watchers or accomplices. Whitaker stood at the door as they prepared to leave. You'll tell me what you find. Evan paused. If it's safe to tell, yes. He wasn't about to give the man false certainty, not with 8 red marks still unanswered. They stepped out into the cold. Snow fell in fine, steady lines, the kind that could hide fresh tracks within minutes. Evan looked once more at the church, at the spot on the north wall, where the hidden door waited, now sealed again but no longer secret, and then climbed into the driver's seat. Lena spread the evidence photo of the map across her knees, tapping each X in turn. Ashland's about 20 minutes if the roads hold. After that, the rural site Hart's taking is maybe 30 from here. Let's hope the storm doesn't close the gap, Evan said. Shadow sat in the back, gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if he already knew the route. The radio crackled with Hart's voice, teams in position. Rolling out in 3. Evan keyed his mic. Copy that. Ashland team moving now. Keep channel open. He eased the car into the street, the tires crunching over snowpack. The church receded in the mirrors, but the weight of the basement stayed with him. The blinking eyes, the pale faces, the heavy paper map with its marks like drops of blood. 8 left. 8 possible rooms like the one they had just opened. 8 chances to bring more people out into the light. He pushed the car a little faster. The sooner they started, the better their odds. Snow churned under the tires as Evan steered into the industrial fringe Ashland's warehouse district, looming like a row of sleeping giants. The wind off the freight yard was sharp enough to bite through layers, scouring the pavement and stacking snow against chain-link fences. Lena kept the evidence photo of the church map on her lap, her finger tapping the red X that corresponded to this address. "Half these buildings are condemned," she murmured. Perfect place to disappear. Shadow's ears pricked before Evan even slowed. The shepherd shifted forward in the back seat, nose pressed to the glass body, angling toward a narrow access lane. Between 2 corrugated steel walls, Evan caught the sign, Blake & Son. Blake & Son Storage. Closed. The lot beyond was dusted in fresh snow except for the track of boot prints winding along the side toward the rear. "Those weren't here long," Lena said. Evan eased the car past the front gate and cut the engine. They moved quickly, Shadow leading their boots, sinking into the crisp layer. The prints were crisp-edged, no drift softening them yet. Whoever made them was minutes ahead. The track swung around the far corner. As they turned, a figure in a dark parka broke from behind a loading dock, a duffel slung across his chest. The man saw them and bolted. Police Evan's voice cracked through the wind. "Stop!" The man, tall, broad-shouldered, didn't even glance back. He powered through the snow toward an alley of stacked pallets. Shadow lunged Evan, releasing the lead with a sharp command. The shepherd tore across the lot, closing the gap with practiced precision. Lena flanked left, cutting off the alley's far end. Evan closed from behind. The man juked once, but Shadow's momentum took him low at the thigh teeth, locking just enough to unbalance. The duffel hit the snow as the man went down, hard cursing. Evan was on him in 2 strides, one knee in his back wrist, twisted cuffs clicking into place. "Name," Evan said. The man twisted his head eyes sharp under a wool cap. "Derek Mallory." "Doesn't matter who I am, you're too late." Lena retrieved the duffel. Inside, 2 flash drives, a stack of small spiral notebooks, and a folded sheet of heavy paper. She opened it and froze. "Evan," she said, holding it out. It was another map. Same thick stock as the church's same hand-drawn red X's, and it matched perfectly down to the annotations in the margins. If anything, this one was more current, 3 of the X's circled in blue ink with dates from the past week. Evan glanced at Derek. "You've been busy?" Derek's jaw flexed. "You don't know half of it." They hauled him into the warehouse office, a small unheated room with a metal desk and a window fogged from years of grime. Derek sat in the lone chair Shadow posted in the doorway like a sentry. Lena set the 2 maps side by side on the desk. The alignment was uncanny. Even the X's Shadow had shown interest in during previous searches, abandoned greenhouses, a derelict train depot were marked. "These sites," Evan said, "they're all active." Derek gave a humorless laugh. "Active more than you think. They rotate people, gear, supplies. Never more than a few days in one spot. You find one, the rest scatter." "Who runs it?" "That's above my pay grade." He leaned back, testing the cuffs. "I keep keys. Make sure certain doors open when they're supposed to. Close them when it's time to vanish." Lena flipped open one of the spiral notebooks from the duffel. Each page was a grid of dates, times, and initials, three-letter codes that could be people or locations. Some matched the handwritten notes on the map. "You're the one who's been seeding these sites," Lena said. Derek shrugged. "I'm one of many." Evan kept his voice flat. "Where's the next move?" A long silence. Derek's eyes shifted to Shadow, who hadn't taken his gaze off the man since the chase ended. "Does the dog always stare like that?" "When you're lying," Evan said. Derek's lips tightened. "Ashfield grain silos. They're next, but you didn't hear it from me." Evan marked the silos on Lena's copy of the map. That put them at one of the outer spokes in the circle the red X's formed. If the silos were in play, the ring was closing. "Anything else?" Evan asked. "Yeah," Derek said with a slow, deliberate smile. "You think you're chasing us, but we've been watching you since the church." "Check your mirrors." Evan didn't bite. "We're done here." They called Hart for pickup, relaying the new location and the duplicate map. Hart's static-laced reply confirmed the rural team had hit their first site, another basement, this one under an abandoned feed store. More survivors and signs the place had been vacated in a hurry. While waiting for transport, Evan stepped outside. The wind had eased, but the snow kept falling, erasing their tracks even as they stood there. He looked back at the warehouse, a shell empty except for the office and whatever ghosts Derek had left behind. The idea of a network threading through town, hidden behind ordinary doors, felt heavier now. Inside, Lena was photographing every page of the notebooks. "These codes," she said, "will run them through intel. See if they match property records or known aliases." Evan nodded, eyes on the two maps again. Every X was a possible locked room. Another hatch, another set of eyes squinting into the light. And Shadow, with his uncanny precision, had already chosen some of them before the ink on the church map had meaning. When the transport arrived, they loaded Derek into the back duffel bag, tagged as evidence. Hart's voice came over the radio. 2 sites down. 6 left. Moving on the silos. Evan keyed his mic. "We'll rendezvous after Ashfield. Keep your people tight." As the vehicle pulled away, Shadow hopped into the back of Evan's SUV, tail thumping once against the seat. Evan glanced in the rear view. The warehouse receded into the curtain of snow, its secrets packed into evidence bags, and the mind of a man who called himself a key keeper. He turned to Lena. "Next stop, silos." She tapped the map, her breath fogging the glass. 6 left. And if Mallory's right, they know we're coming. Evan shifted into gear. "Then we move faster." They drove into the white curtain, the lines between hunter and hunted blurring with every mile. They reached the old diner on Route 6, while the storm was still deciding whether it wanted to fall, a thin lace of snow drifting sideways across the highway, and collecting in the lips of tire ruts, the neon sign long dead. But the ghost of its red script still clinging to the aluminum trim like an afterimage. And Evan Cole eased the SUV along the frontage shoulder and killed the lights so the building could keep pretending it was alone. While Lena Park checked the photo of the county map for the 10th time, and Shadow, steady as a metronome, angled his body toward the back lot, where deliveries once arrived, with boxes of onions and coffee cans and pleasant noise, where trouble prefers to slip in, because trouble appreciates the privacy of alleys and dumpsters and the hum of a walk-in compressor no one listens to on purpose. The front door had the haughty resistance of old public places. Its handle warped with cold hinges, gummy with time, a band of gray dust riding the threshold like a tide line. Yet even that stubbornness gave them information, because the dust remained unbroken and the scuffs on the sill all faced outward from years ago. While Shadow ignored it entirely, towing Evan around the corner with the quiet insistence of a partner who declines debate tail a straight punctuation mark, nose stitching the air as if he were reading the room's diary through the vents. And there on the back step beneath a bent security light, housing the story sharpened into fresh facts. A ladder of small, crisp footprints laid into the powder at a childish stride, the prints of a larger pair overlapping them in places. And a brush smear where something soft had been dragged or a blanket had kissed the snow in a hurry. Fresh, Lena said, half a whisper that still found the radio. Edges sharp, no drift. Evan crouched to frame the toes of one print with his palm and felt the old tug, the mix of anger and tenderness you get when the world reminds you how small both danger and hope can be. Then rose and took the rear handle tested, and it felt the give of a door that had been exercised recently, and he breathed once in a way that made his body lighter for the exact length of a heartbeat, then opened with the steadiness of a man who already knows what the air will say inside. The kitchen greeted them with that layered smell. Every closed restaurant keeps like a folded apron, ancient grease in the vents. Metal that remembers heat flowers somewhere that learned to float. When a fan kicked on and above that, a current of colder scents, the clean bite of a new plastic jug opened and left uncapped the papery tang of cardboard that has been torn, the minted note of antiseptic, used by someone who understands enough to wipe, but not enough to wipe well. All of it washed by the lightest thread of human presence. A nervous perspiration that hangs low when fear is told to be quiet. Shadow made a slow, deliberate circle, claws ticking on tile. His head tilted to take the scent lines like reading musical staff. And then he tracked a narrow path through the prep line where fryers sulked and a grill wore a blanket of gray, past a pass-through window where a pair of cracked plates still squatted as if awaiting late orders, and into the back-of-house storage where the cinder block walls wore water stains like maps of old storms. In the powdery film on the floor, flour or drywall dust or both. Evan saw the clearest proof of recent movement, the faint brush of a shoe's tread repeated in the same pattern as the prints outside, and pressed into the flour at one point, a neat oval where a bottle had rested and then lifted. Someone staged here, Lena said, already shooting wide and detail frames already marking a trail in the dust, with numbered placards, the way you leave breadcrumbs for the version of yourself that must argue later in rooms with no windows. He nodded and let the room talk, because rooms always talk when your own breathing is quiet, and it told him there had been a pause in the night, the particular kind of pause you see in way stations. A utility lamp's cord snaked to a wall outlet, a stack of heat-sealed meal pouches torn open and half-eaten, the foil liners reflecting their flashlight beams like a row of small moons. A rolling rack pushed to hide the scuffs around the hinge line of a door that had been used too many times for a door that should have retired. And when he pried the rolling rack a hand's width, the hinge line confessed itself. The fire door into the walk-in cooler latch, polished by hand's seal, bearing the gloss left by tape taken off and put on again. Shadow's nose touched the seam and stayed there, a kind of canine semaphore that said, this was the path, this was where bodies breathed, and then moved. So Evan opened the cooler slowly and let the light pour into the white box, where restaurants cool down the world, and one wall of wire shelving had been stripped to make space for crates that weren't labeled for food, generic double-wall cartons, printed only with the manufacturer's claim that they were recyclable, the kind of boxes you can fill with anything and feel clean while you do it, and on the floor, a rectangle of foam cushion where someone had let a small human sleep. Lena's beam found a set of handwritten initials on the inner door jamb just above hip height, the pencil strokes recent enough that the graphite still shone a little. RH, she read aloud. Then beneath Mon 4, in a squiggle that could be a time or a symbol, only the network understood. Check the office, Evans said, and she moved, and he followed the thin bright of her light out past the line, again, past the prep sink, where a new sponge lay, uncharacteristically alone, into a narrow corridor next to the dish pit, where the manager's office sat like a metal shoebox, with one eye up. A wire mesh window that allowed supervision in better years and allowed none of this now. The office answered them with a stale sigh when the door swung. The desk sat clean in a way. No working desk sits, its surfaces wiped drawers, emptied the chair still bearing the faint indent of a heavier body, the sway-back posture of a man who doesn't stand for his phone calls. Lena ran her gloved fingers along the underside of the desk and found tape adhesive still tacky, a piece larger than it should be, and peeled it up. The adhesive had been wrapped around something with a rectangular cross-section. The printed residue mirrored faintly on the glue. "Burner phone mount," she said, "recently removed." Evan traced the wall by the filing cabinet with the back of his knuckles until the paneling gave a different note, then pried a loose kickboard free and revealed a void where papers had once slid, and at the far end of the void, a clipped corner of something that had not gotten the message to evacuate. He coaxed it forward with a gloved fingertip and brought out a torn sheet with the top left kept and the rest ripped away, the kept portion bearing the edge of a printed header, Millops. And beneath that, the ends of words that had lost their beginnings, schedule fragments with colons, like spine bones. He looked at Lena and felt the same sentence pass between them, without needing syntax, the grain processing plant, the one the county still called the mill. Even though the company had rebranded it into something with a venture capital shine, stood 3 miles east along a spur road that stayed quiet in snow. Because its trucks knew better than to get stuck, and if you wanted to move people with speed under cover of noise and vibration and the illusion of a legitimate night crew, you could slide them through the plant's dark bones faster than prayer. "Copy for Hart," Lena said, already pushing the fragment into a sleeve and snapping a photo with a scale card, already calling the sergeant with her other hand to say the word mill aloud. So the entire night rearranged itself. While she worked, Evan lifted the duffel Shadow had found in the cooler, the one that sat back in the corner, as if embarrassed by its own usefulness, and he dumped it onto the desk. 3 two-way radios with earpieces, their channels pre-tuned. A roll of blue gaffer tape, a stack of white visitor badges pre-printed with Grainworks Logistics and left blank in the name field, and zipped into a flat pouch laminated floor diagrams that matched a plant he had been inside only once, on a spring tour for a group of high school kids who wanted to see how cereal was born. "Internal comms," he said, lifting one radio and turning the volume down to a whisper, letting the squelch clear and the channel settle. At first the set carried only the usual snow of empty air. Then a voice slid into place like a card in a deck. The tone casual with the false cheer of night work. "Load door 3 cleared. B shift, keep it quiet on yard," followed by another voice, thinner, closer to a whine. "Copy, watch that side camera. It glitches if you tap the trunk line. Don't ask me how I know," a laugh that traveled badly through cheap speaker cones. And then, most important, "Hold 2 for transfer before the 4 o'clock sweep." Lena's eyes met his over the desk, and every detail of the earlier map, every red X, every penciled initial, felt like a nerve. "They're still there," she said. "Or they think they are," he answered, which in practice meant the same next step. Shadow stood in the office doorway, the block of him perfectly still. That amber coat catching the low spill from the hall, the way honey catches late afternoon, and Evan thanked him without words, because without the dog's geometry, the way he drew straight lines to secrets, this diner would still be just a sad postcard on the side of the highway. They worked the remainder of the building at speed, not sloppily. Just with the efficiency you earn after years of learning how clutter hides nothing and corners hide everything. And they collected what the room would admit to a shipping manifest with dates that mirrored the margins of the church map. A pair of latex gloves jammed behind the service register. A receipt book missing the middle, its carbons torn away, and in the walk-in's drain strainer, a scrap of cloth that had once been part of a sleeve, the weave cheap, the seam amateur. Outside, Nolan Hart's second unit slid into the lot and posted on the frontage road as overwatch, while the forensics van backed down the alley with the patient beep of a thing better at certainty than people are. In the lull, as forms were signed and chain of custody labels kissed plastic, Evan walked to the rear step again and stared at the small footprints, now paling as fresh snowfall tried to do its erasing work. And he let himself imagine only for the length of one breath the moment a small hand might find a paper cup of tea in a fellowship hall, a lopsided sock, a quiet bathroom, the honest privacy of a stall with a lock whose sound you can trust. Time to move. Hart said at his shoulder, the words carrying both command and permission. Because all the learning in all the evidence rooms reduces to this. You either go when the window opens or you tell yourself a story later about why you stayed. Evan gave the diner a last look, the pass through the cooler, the desk stripped of its pretense, and then motioned Lena toward the SUV. Shadow jumped in without being asked, as if he had always known the next line in tonight's script, and the convoy shifted from alley to road with the stealth of people who want luck to retain its sympathy. As the highway took them east, the snow found new discipline and began to fall in plumb lines. The wind dropping as if holding its own breath, giving them a clear field. And Lena spread the laminated diagrams on her knees, the way she had spread the map earlier, her finger tracing the route that made the most tactical sense service road along the southern fence security hut with limited sight lines, a catwalk over the blending floor. The old grain dryers retired, but still good as cover, and the freight apron, where door 3 waited like a mouth. "Come, say 4 o'clock sweep," she said. "We have 90 minutes if their clocks and hours agree." "They won't." Evan said, meaning it as a spur rather than a caution, and pressed a little harder on the accelerator, feeling the vehicle settle into purpose. Behind them, the first X on the map, Route 6 diner shrunk to a pinprick in the mirror, a place that had served as a table for a meal. No one should have eaten a layover for a journey. No one should have been forced to take, and ahead of them, the mill's lights rose out of the snow like a small city. The plumes from the grain stacks pulling their white scarves into the sky, and in the cabin of the SUV, the radios breathed with quiet life. The channel still open, the night shift, still pretending night, is just another day. They tightened seat belts and checked pockets for the small things that make big moves. Smoother fresh gloves, spare batteries, a folded strip of gauze tucked where a hand can find it without thinking. And Evan felt that low, good fear. The kind that stops hands from shaking by admitting they want to. The kind that keeps eyes honest. And he looked once at Shadow in the rear-view mirror and once at Lena's pencil tapping the route. And he said the only thing left to say, before an entry we go soft. We go steady. We bring them up. The mill drew closer, and the diner's dust already felt like the prelude it had been, and the radios gave them one final gift. As they turned off Route 6 onto the service road, a voice so close it seemed to sit in the back seat with them. "Door 3 is green. Hold the transfer until the sweep clears. We're almost full." The lights died first. Hiccup in the bones of the mill. Then a smear of red from an emergency beacon stuttered and vanished, and the entire blending floor fell into a living dark that tasted of metal and flour and fear dust hanging like a silver fog above the conveyors. And in that heartbeat, between sound and silence, the auxiliary generator coughed, faltered again, and stopped, leaving only breath and the faraway tick of cooling steel. So Evan Cole raised an open hand to hold the panic where it stood, while Lena Park's voice, low and certain, braided a path through bodies that wanted to run, and Shadow Amber Coat warm. Even in this ash-gray gloom, gave 2 short barks and one long, a pattern they'd learned to follow when eyes could not. And that was how the line moved, hand to sleeve, sleeve to shoulder, shoulder to rail. Shoes finding steps by music rather than sight, as grain dust spun soft galaxies in the dark, and the stuck freight lift shivered under the weight of a life that would not ride. No sparks. Evan said a breath more than a word because dust explodes when insulted. And every belt buckle, every loose screw, every bad habit carries its own fuse. Lena clipped a chem light and let it bloom a small moon by the stair enough to name the edge, without offending the air. Then crouched beside the woman whose panic had swelled until it filled the room, palms open, voice threading steady assurances between each fast burst of breath until the rush softened, and the woman nodded once and clung to the rope Evan had anchored to a stanchion, while 2 officers cranked the lift's manual wheel until the carriage crept down like a slow prayer. And Shadow, alive to the geometry of fear, anchored himself at the landing and kept time with that low metronomic woof that says a door waits at the top and we will find it together. They had entered quiet, the way you enter a place that eats sound for a living. Skirting door 3, where the yard camera blinked a sleepy green, and a nightman with a clipboard loved his coffee too much to love his job. Lena peeled him into a pocket of shadow and borrowed his badge, while Evan leaned past the threshold and let the plant's rhythms map themselves in his bones. The slow exhale of dryers retired, but still warm with memory. The hum of conveyors shifting grain from belly to throat, the distant clatter where pellet mills stitched noise into the night. And then they were under the catwalk, through a service door, down a short run of stairs, into a corridor that smelled of bleach and paper. And the human wish to make a room mean the opposite of what it means. The pens sat in a row, chain link welded to square tube improvised gates, held with quick release clips, as if someone wanted speed, when speed suited them. Each pen no larger than a walk-in closet, a blanket for cushioning a 5-gallon jug of water with a spigot pressed into its belly. A bucket meant for feed reimagined as a bathroom. A small insult covered in a larger lie. 26 people blinked into their light faces, pinched small by months that should have been days, and the first thing Evan did was make the room slow, because fast breaks people, even when fast saves them, so he named himself. And Lena and the dog, he said the word. Up like a promise, he said, warm and quiet, and doctor, and then the gates came open. Clips pinging like small bells, and the first ones who could walk, walked, and the ones who could not were wrapped and lifted with the kind of respect that makes a spine remember itself. They had almost cleared the row when the generator hiccuped and failed a single throat-cut note that sucked the color out of everything. Alarms choking halfway to voice and dying to a red ember that didn't help anyone. The lift stalled with a shudder. 3 feet shy of the landing, the carriage askew, the counterweight humming its complaint behind sheet metal, and somewhere overhead a maintenance relay clicked in a pattern Evan distrusted like a coin tapped on a metal desk by someone who likes the sound of waiting. Manual drop, he said. Hart's team, already securing the yard, pushed through the south door's shoulders and hands, turning metal that did not want to move, and the lift began its slow descent. But the rhythm was wrong. Sticky jerk, a rhythm that makes braces fail, so they abandoned the box and took the stairs in 2 files. Rope between them like a single thought, chem lights marking each turn. Lena, halfway up, halfway down, wherever a voice was needed, and shadow-blessed Animal held the line with his song. 2 short, 1 long, a lighthouse voice in a storm of flour. On the dock, wind carried the dust away, and EMS built a small city from nothing. Cots unfurled to heat lamps, humming bottles cracked open a row of socks like flags of truce on the tailgate of a truck, so the line of 26 translated from dark to light. Each pair of feet stepping from steel to wood to rubber. Each set of eyes widening when the cold morning met them, like an honest witness. The woman who had panicked kissed Lena's gloved knuckles and whispered something that sounded like a child's name, then turned her face toward the lamp and closed her eyes, letting the heat write a new line of story across her cheeks. Inside again, Evan and Hart swept the corridor for stragglers and for signs, and the plant confessed. What plants confess once humans stop pretending. Glove prints on a painted rail where someone without calluses had leaned too hard. A schedule board with magnets that knew more than the man paid to read them. A visitor badge torn in half and stuffed under a mop sink. The top sheet of a manifest with transfer hold stamped at 0355 in a red that tried too hard to look official. Lena found a satchel in a janitor closet with radios set to the yard channel. 2 spare earpieces, 3 laminated diagrams of the blending floor, and a folded county map that matched the churches, with one difference: the X over the mill had been circled twice, and then smudged as if a thumb had made a decision and erased its own confidence. By first light, the count stood real and unforgiving. 26 souls lifted from the chain-link rooms, triaged, warmed, witnessed. And when Nolan Hart finished his tally, adding the church to the school to the mill, he gave Evan the line every cop learns to say without ceremony, because ceremony wastes time. We're north of 70 now. He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't have to. The sentence put weight under everyone's feet. They cleared the last corner, sealed the bad doors for the last time, and let the plant return to the honest business of being a building without a secret. The radios quieted, the yard camera blinked into a sleep it deserved. And Shadow finally lay down on a folded blanket and sighed in that way. Only Dog Sigh, his amber coat catching the first pale stripe of day sable along his spine, dark as a promise kept. When the convoy rolled, Lena sat in the passenger seat with the evidence bag spread across her knees. The county map beneath the plastic, a living thing, creases like veins. The red X's like a constellation that insists you learn its name. 3 marks remained without a line through them. 3 corners of a design that had thought itself clever enough to survive winter. And as the tires found clean pavement and the mill fell away behind them and the field hospital hummed on without them, the map seemed to hum too. A quiet vibration Evan felt in his elbows through the steering wheel, as if the paper wanted to warn them that rest tonight would be honest and brief. A pause rather than a finish, a comma rather than a period, because 3 red X's still waited and the dog in the back seat already knew which way they would turn. By mid-morning, the fellowship hall had become a quilt of small mercies, steam rising from paper cups, socks warming on registers, soft laughter arriving in careful stitches. And amid that new brightness, the stories began to surface the way fish rise when the water calms. Survivors speaking in low, precise lines about the schedules that ruled their nights. About the vans that arrived between 1 and 4 in the morning when snow softened tire noise and porch lights were mostly asleep about the rule. That people never stayed long in one room, about the way transfers always rode on top of another activity so the world would hear forklifts and fan belts and ignore footsteps, and as each detail found its place on the table. Evan Cole listened with his shoulders loose and his pen steady, while Shadow lay at his heel, amber coat catching the hall's pale daylight like honey poured thin. They described a cadence you could almost set a clock by a sweep every few days, when hands moved fast and orders traveled by short radio phrases that sounded ordinary. Unless you knew how to hear them, they remembered the tinny chime of a phone alarm that meant blankets rolled and shoes tied. The smell of bleach that arrived 2 hours before movement, the taste of crackers when stomachs had to do work without making noise, and they gave street names that curved along the county's lesser arteries. Old Rook Road to the freight spur, Abbott Lane to the grain plant, the short unmarked cut-through behind the feed store. Each route a line they had learned by feel, even when windows stayed blacked out. Lena Park built a living map on the fellowship wall, anchoring a county printout with push pins and stretching cotton thread between red X's as if she were stitching the town back together. While Nolan Hart cross-referenced dates scribbled on the church map and times stamped on a mill manifest. And arrival windows, whispered by a woman whose voice carried the exact calm of someone who has already decided to survive. And the shapes began to repeat in a way only patterns can, the kind of repetition you sense first in your ribs and then in your brain, until the whole room understood how the network kept itself hidden. Never crowd one place, never speak names that mean anything. Never let a door be the same door twice. Federal agents arrived without fanfare, and with enviable logistics, victim advocates sliding in beside medics with blankets and calm. A mobile clinic folding itself open in the parking lot like a steel flower case. Agents taking quiet statements in Sunday school classrooms, decorated with suns and glue, evidence texts cataloging radio frequencies and badge templates, and a stack of notebooks from Derek Mallory's duffel. And an assistant U.S. attorney walked the edges of the hall with a legal pad and a smile that told the room he planned to earn their trust rather than borrow it, while a DHS team coordinated placements and a marshal checked perimeters with the respectful thoroughness of a man who knew that rescue only counts when safety keeps repeating. Evan let the federal train pull even and then share the track portal-to-portal custody logged scene control signed and countersigned, and still he stayed close to the map, because the map had grown into a voice of its own. Its red punctuation marks, no longer abstract, but heavy with faces, and when a teenage boy traced a shaking finger across the county printout to the block. where an old brick school hunkered behind a chain-link fence. He whispered a detail that found oxygen instantly. How the heat there sang in the walls, how the vents would carry a thin tapping that meant we are still here. How one winter night the sound traveled through a pipe like a small heartbeat no one upstairs wanted to admit they heard. They verified the school's utility layout in a file the building department faxed, like an apology. A 1950s boiler system retrofitted clumsily. 2 decades ago, ducts sharing space with old steam lines. The kind of compromise that makes acoustics carry secrets. And Lena's pin for that address shone a fraction brighter to Evan's eye, because memory had already primed him, the church basement's pale rectangle. The diner's cooler crib, the mill's clipped manifest 3 rooms that tried to translate themselves into normalcy and failed. 3 rooms that had taught him to trust the geometry of silence. Shadow rose when the hall's warmth and food finally gave way to purpose again. That spring-loaded gather of muscle that dogs inherit from older wolves. And the room seemed to tilt a degree toward the door as Evan called assignments with the gentle tempo you use when people have slept too little and feel too much. Hart taking a federal team and 2 locals to recheck rural sites for anything. A hurried exit leaves Lena on comms and points with Evan, 2 advocates riding to the school in case voices needed a witness the moment the door opened. EMS notified that a boiler room is a different sort of air than a storage bay that steam burns require another kind of glove. They rolled with lights quiet in a column that looked more like a procession than a raid. The storm giving them a corridor of clear sky as if the weather itself wanted them to keep pace. And Evan felt the electric alertness that arrives when a plan hums in your fingers. That sense that the night is holding still. So you can do precise work, and he let the SUV ride the crown of the road. While Lena recited the school's basement layout from the fax, while Shadow stood with his paws on the rear sill and watched the dark as if it were a field he had already walked. Old North School rose out of the neighborhood like a ship that had run aground. Windows boarded flagpole, bare brickwork stained with winters that never apologized. And as they killed the engines and walked, the cold pinched their faces into seriousness, while the air around the foundation hummed its low mechanical song, that blend of boiler and wind and something else that might have been wishful thinking. Until Evan put his ear to a grated vent and held his breath and heard faint as a pencil tap beneath a door the smallest rhythm a human hand can make when it has waited long enough to believe someone will finally answer. They approached Old North School in a hush, the brick hulk squatting over a block of wind-polished, snow-boarded windows, wearing frost like cataracts. No sirens, no theatrics. Only the thrum of an aging boiler somewhere underfoot and a breath of steam curling from a grating near the foundation. Evan Cole placed his palm on the vent and felt the faint percussion he had heard through the fellowship hall's map, tap, pause, tap, tap, the smallest language a trapped hand can make. Shadow leaned into the grate, inhaled once, then pivoted left and tracked the wall as if the building exhaled truth at ankle height. On him, Evan said, and the column found the shepherd's cadence across a crusted field to a maintenance hatch half buried in wind-scrolled drifts. The padlock looked tough until Lena Park touched it with a key ring from the district's forgotten archive. Steel yielded, the hatch lifted, and a ribbon of warmer air stroked their faces from the dark. They went in soft, Evan first, then Lena, then 2 federal agents and a medic, then Nolan Hart with a second team. The crawl space opened to a service corridor, brick walls, painted the yellow of old stairwells. Pipes marched overhead in paired ranks, the largest jackets wrapped in frayed insulations like worn-out scarves. From somewhere ahead came the tapping again, patient, rhythmic. Shadow took the corner without a sound and held nose pressed to a seam where plaster had been skimmed over a door too quickly. Here, Evan breathed. Lena found the hinge line under paint with a gloved thumb. A pry bar whispered into place. The panel sloughed free. Beyond it, a short stair descended to a boiler room with pillars and ducts and an old steel beast humming a low winter song. Along the far wall, chain-link pens stood in a row, quick-release clips gleaming where a sweep light had kissed them minutes earlier. Eyes blinked from blankets, the shimmering reflex of pupils meeting brighter air. Evan announced himself, and the team spoke the words that change rooms. Up, warm, quiet, Dr. Water, and the gates answered with soft clicks. Shadow made a pass along the pens, as if counting, then posted at the stair with that lighthouse stillness that turns fear into movement. A teenage boy reached for his collar and drew courage from the texture of fur. A woman in a gray hoodie looped her arm through Lena's and matched her breathing to Lena's steady pace. They moved people in pairs, arm to rail to landing to a stretcher staged at the crawl space mouth. Above ground, the schoolyard had been transformed into a field clinic with heat towers and blankets and the practical affection of professionals. The rhythms they'd learned at the mill paid dividends here. Rope lines, chem lights, soft voices, the discipline of going slow, where slow saves. In less than an hour, the pens were empty. In 2, the boiler room's echoes changed from human to purely mechanical. The search and evidence team cataloged the story. The space refused to keep a loose panel over a duct where air had carried tapping to the outside. A clipboard with an abbreviated log initials. Arrows, tiny circles drawn at odd hours. A small cache of granola bars hidden behind an inspection plate. On a shelf sat a radio tuned to a local yard channel and a crude schedule taped above it. R6 Diner, Mill, School, RT40. The hand that wrote it loved speed more than secrecy. By the time the last survivor was checked, fed, and wrapped, the tally across 3 days glowed like a stubborn ember in Hart's notebook. Church, mill, school. Numbers arced upward with the same inevitability as sunrise. North of 70 had been last night's truth. Now it looked smaller than the day required. Federal intake lines unfurled. Advocates ferried quiet strength between cots. A marshal posted at the main door, his postures saying this building answered to a new idea of safety. Evan stood at the map table set up in the school's old music room, where staff had pushed aside a scarred piano and rolled out county prints. Cotton thread linked the church to the diner, to the mill, to the school in a red geometry that made the town's secret architecture visible. Lena trimmed a fresh length and tied one end at the school pin. "The spoke pattern holds," she said. "We keep hitting the hub-adjacent sites, we keep bleeding the wheel." Shadow settled by the radiator and slept with the exhaustion that arrives only after a job understands it has been done for now. Evan watched the dog's ribs rise and fall, that amber coat bright even under fluorescent hum, and felt the quiet conviction that had been forming since the church steps hardened into policy the dog led always. Not as mascot or charm, but as point. On entries, on corridors, at doors disguised by paint and pride, Shadow knew where breath lived. If a room held the living, he would anchor to it. If air carried a ghost of warmth, he would find the seam where certainty could get its fingers under and lift. He gathered the team and made it explicit. Shadow leads. We build around his lines. We keep our noise profile low and our edges soft. The pattern says there are at least a few more spoke sites. We do them with the same discipline that got us through the mill and here. Hart nodded, flipping a page in his notebook. Rural checks confirm hurried exits. Feed store on County 18 was prepped but abandoned. 2 more pins show new tape marks, recent use. An agent ducked into the room, breath fogging. "Intel bulletin just hit," she said. "Intercepted local comms and a found schedule match. Next likely move Route 40 feed warehouse. Windows align with their transfer cadence." Lena traced the route with a pencil. South fence loading wells, grain chutes used as cover, aisles tight. Lots of dust. Same hazard profile as the mill. "We go with the same rules," Evan said. "Chem lights, rope eyes. Patience. And we let the dog write the first sentence at every door." They packed with that practiced economy crises teach. Spare gloves slid into pockets. Radios checked to a common channel. Advocates placed a hand on a few shoulders and promised to be here when they returned. Outside, the storm had pared itself down to glitter in blue air, the kind of weather that sharpens sound. Evan paused at the threshold and listened once more to the building. The boiler thudded. Ducts sighed. No tap announced itself, only the ordinary language of heat and brick and relief. He looked down. Shadow was already standing, tail steady, gaze angled toward a map the dog could not see, and yet seemed to read. Evan clipped the lead and felt that familiar tug, the simplest instruction in the world. They reached the feed warehouse off Route 40 under a noon sky the color of tin. The kind of brittle winter light that exaggerates edges and lets dust sparkle where it floats. And as Evan Cole rolled the SUV past a line of hay trailers that hadn't moved in weeks, the wind came across the flats with a dry sweetness that only baled straw can hold, a scent that slips through cracked doors and tells you in one breath that animals have been fed here for decades and that someone recently used those old habits as cover for something else. Lena Park unfolded a photocopy of the county map and pressed it against the window's glare, her pencil landing on the inked X that sat like a button over this lot. And Shadow, reading a map none of them could see, shifted forward with a tiny chuff eyes fixed on the galvanized silhouettes of the silos that rose from the concrete like gray trees without leaves. They took the outer walk with their usual restraint, the team fanning to the margins, where sight lines do more work and footprints learn to be useful. And what the storm had not erased, the yard had preserved the shallow, irregular stippling of small tires. The wider bites of forklift treads and a double track that turned in a tight half-moon and backed hard to a loading pit. The rear bumper's imprint crisp enough in the packed snow and oil to hold brand lettering if you leaned close. Evan leaned and read Barlow, a local rental outfit, and he knew before Hart keyed the name into a handheld that the contract would be under a shell account because the network liked the ordinary so much it wore it thin. The south dock door resisted the first test out of habit rather than intent, the weather seal crackling away from the jam when Lena worked a flat bar into a vulnerable spot in the aluminum and curled it back like the lip of a can, and the smell that rolled out when the panel climbed was the childhood scent of elevator barns and feed bins, molasses and hay and powder ground fine, only now threaded with the faint trace of adhesive and plastic wrap. And beneath that human presence that had learned to live secret without shedding itself entirely. Shadow crossed the threshold with his head low, the way he moved when he wanted to taste air as information and his paws ticked across concrete toward the shadowed gap between two bulk bins, where a maintenance ladder rose through a forest of cross-bracing, the rungs polished in that particular way that suggests more than a maintenance man's weight and more recent than someday. Ox ladder, Lena said, already angling her light up through the web of angle iron, and the silvered strip of wear on each rung gleamed back like a mirror held at noon. Shadow sniffed the ladder once, then turned toward the grain pits, the rectangular mouths in the floor where trucks give their bellies back to the building. And he lowered his nose to the grated throat of the nearest and breathed long, then short, then long again, that cadence he uses when he is taking a census of a place's ghosts. They worked the pit perimeter carefully because the concrete remembered falls and the grating flexed a little with time, and the evidence that wanted to be found revealed itself in modest offerings. A brown thread from a cheap blanket snagged on a bolt head. A smear of green paint on the pit lip that matched the color of a duffel. They had already bagged at the diner a piece of gaffer tape adhered to the underside of the grate, where a wire tie still hugged it, its tail cut clean with flush cutters enough to say that something had been secured here recently and pulled up in a hurry when schedules changed or radios whispered that schedules would change soon. Beyond the pits, the open floor had been sorted into a map of its own kind. Pallets wrapped in plastic, labeled with stencils that spoke the language of ranches and veterinary supply salt licks, stacked like gray loaves mineral buckets in dull reds and blues, and a neat pyramid of feed sacks, whose printed brand the town had trusted long before anyone drew red X's on a county map. A forklift sat with its forks down and in a posture of rest, its key absent, its seat still bearing the faint warmth of a worker who had left his shift quickly or never started it, honestly. Evan walked the aisles with an eye for places where ordinary had been asked to do extraordinary work and found tucked behind a bale corral that had been pushed askew, a baker's rack of clipboard hooks, 4 of them bare, and one holding a manifest that looked at first glance like an inventory list, and at second like a route planner, written with the caution of someone who knows lists live longer than they should. Initials in one column, quantities in another. A third-headed drop with check marks in pencil that had been erased and redrawn harder, the paper worn thin under the insistence. Lena photographed each sheet with a scale card and then turned the page to find what Evan hoped for and dreaded in equal measure, a 1-page summary clipped to the back that tied the tidy fiction of feed distribution to the uglier truth of supply lines moving between red X's, 10 lines that began R6 GW Mill ONS and RT40 and ended in abbreviations that had to be properties. NW Farm, Whitlow Barrow, the last 2 written in a hand that pressed hard through the paper as if the muscle of the writer wanted to leave a mark on the wood beneath. When Hart stepped into the aisle and Lena passed him the sheet, his face did that small tightening at the eyes he does when a puzzle gives him both the corner pieces and the promise that the sky will still take hours. Transport cadence, he said, tapping the drop column. Feed is cover, real cargo on top of cover. Same windows we've been hearing 1, 2, 4 a.m. Never after first light. They're batching motion like a rail yard. Routes line up with the church, the diner, the mill, the school. Lena added, aligning the manifest with her photo of the annotated county map, threads of red and cotton superimposed in her mind, and looked north of the river. 2 endpoints repeat initials, NF1 and NF2. They're not going to be barns with happy endings. They're going to be farms with cellars. Shadow's head came up at the word cellars in that uncanny way of his, as if language had a smell and some words carried undertones he disliked, and he angled away from the manifest toward a line of straw bale stacks that stood too straight to be casual. He trotted their length, paused at the last, and set his forepaws on a bale, nose digging gently, then more insistent, until the straw parted to show the fresh bite of a screw head set into a plywood deck, a false floor laid to look like careless storage. Evan eased the bale aside with a grunt and brought the light in close. And there it was, a plywood panel cut to the size of the footprint edges, slightly beveled, a finger hole drilled and corked with a wood plug, stained to match the kind of clandestine craft that feeds on time and thrives on neglect. They lifted the panel into the smell of dust that had not been breathed since last night, and a narrow crawl opened into a stub hallway running toward the outer wall, its concrete smooth where shoulders had made contact and rough elsewhere, the path of 1,000 careful trips compressed into one readable surface. At the end, a rectangular cavity in the foundation yawned big enough for a person to crouch, and on the ledge sat the tools of quick departures, a bolt cutter, a coil of nylon rope. 2 blank visitor badges with Grainworks Logistics, pre-printed a roll of blank pallet labels, and a half-used canister of wasp spray that someone had repurposed to fog cameras with propellant rather than kill insects. Lena bagged the lot while Evan ran a finger along the concrete and released a fine fringe of straw, the sort of thing that rides pant cuffs and tells a different story than the one told on manifests. In the foreman's office, a cinder-block cube with a window overlooking the loading wells, Hart found a gray metal cabinet locked with a round dial key. He didn't need a key. A fueling wrench gave him leverage, and the lock admitted its lie. Inside were binders that pretended to be OSHA, and were OSHA, and behind them a flat courier pouch that pretended to be nothing, and was instead what they needed: purchase orders for bulk feed pickups that matched dates they had already circled on the diner's schedule, and 2 slips for North Whitlow Farm and Barrow Pike Farm, both in the northern reaches where the map turns from gridded streets to nameless lanes that lead to windbreaks and long views. As they cataloged, the warehouse confessed more network muscle in small ways. The mezzanine office carpet still flattened where a chair had rolled back in haste. A coffee cup with a heat ring that hadn't fully dried, an invoice printer with the last job half-queued. So the next press would have spat out a page that said what someone wasn't ready to say aloud. And every admission made the geometry of the spoken hub clearer. Products moved outward as cover people moved with product returns, carried nothing but news, and each site kept just enough gear to impersonate legitimate commerce if a deputy happened by with questions and a need to get home before the plow banked the driveway closed. By the time the forensics team arrived and took the slow, careful photographs that make rooms remember themselves, the shape of the wheel on Lena's map had begun to feel less like abstraction and more like a thing they could hold with both hands. Hub at the church, first spokes at the diner and mill and school. This feed warehouse as a supply node, and beyond it, 2 points set north like eyes on a face. The last places you would choose if your design needed quiet and deep spaces and doors that open into earth instead of air. Evan thought of the county's old farmhouses, their storm shelters and root cellars, how those rooms keep apples and secrets equally well. And he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that comes when pattern turns into plan. He stepped onto the loading wells and let the cold clear his head. The wind combing the smell of straw and molasses out of the building, and Shadow joined him with a small bump of a shoulder against his knee, the dog's breath rising in quick plumes that looked like thought. Across the yard, a crow hopped on the rim of a stock tank and watched them with the disdain only crows perfect. Behind him, Lena spoke with an advocate on the phone, arranging for an arrival that would be gentler than most her voice, a steady seam stitching 1 hour to the next. Hart leaned in the office doorway, reading the farm slips again, as if the ink could confess new lines under a harder gaze. 2 northern farms, Hart said, holding up the slips between 2 fingers like a summary. Whitlow and Barrow. Both with basements on the county record, both on gravel roads that plows hit last. Storm cellars, Lena said, answering a thought rather than a sentence. And root rooms that don't show on any drawing, Evan added, because every farm has modifications that outlive their paperwork. They sealed the hidden crawl with a temporary mark that would keep honest people honest for a few hours, and left the warehouse to its ordinary inventory of salt and hay and buckets, and as the convoy nosed back onto Route 40, the light shifted toward the kind of late afternoon that bleaches color, a sign that time had thinned again and would not indulge them. In the cab, Lena flattened the map on her knees, and the 2 northern X's, once simple glyphs, now wore names and the weight of imagined doors. While Shadow, reading ahead, placed his chin on the console and stared through the windshield, as if the road itself were a sentence he intended to finish. They drove north with the radio quiet by design, and the tires chewing the clean stripe between plow berms, and the thought of earth under wood, under straw, under sky, gathered into a single urgent line. Not fear exactly, not anger, exactly more like resolve, finding its proper size, and by the time the highway narrowed to a county lane that ran between windbreaks and frozen fields, the conclusion required no speech at all. The last links of the wheel would be farms, and farms keep their deepest rooms underground. The wind slashed sideways across the north fields, combing thin snow into ripples that looked like pale water frozen mid-wave. North Whitlow Farm stood alone against the sky, a farmhouse of grayed clapboard and a barn that had outlived better winters, its laying 2 ruts between windbreaks. Evan Cole cut the engine before the gate. The quiet let the place say what it wanted to say. Shadow lifted his head and inhaled amber coat bright against the dull day. He jumped down without waiting for invitation. Nose low, moving not for the barn or the root cellar door, half buried under drifts, but for the front porch, as if the house itself carried a hidden breath. Lena Park fell in on his shoulder. Sergeant Nolan Hart posted 2 officers to the blind corners and kept the radio channel open, but mute. The farmhouse door yielded to a careful turn. The air inside held a sweet stale of wood smoke, an old carpet, and underneath it, the faintest metallic thread, new hardware in an old room. Shadow crossed the parlor in a straight, uncompromising line, toenails ticking on scarred boards, and stopped on a faded rug whose fringe had been vacuumed into impeccable alignment. He set one paw, then a second, and scraped. The fringe bunched. The rug dragged. Beneath it, a square cut in the floor seams, painted to hide the saw's path, a recessed lift ring polished by use. Trap, Lena murmured. Mechanical heart added eyes mapping angles and weights. At the hatch's far edge, a bell wire vanished into the joists, taut as a violin string. A spring-loaded pin waited under tension next to the hinge, eager to drop a steel bar into place if the plate lifted wrong. It wasn't sophisticated. It was clever. Clever maims. Clever warns. Clever buys minutes. Evan crouched and laid his fingers on the wood. It was faint, but there the ghost of warmth radiating from below, the kind of warmth a crowded body leaves in air that doesn't deserve it. Then, almost too soft to count as sound, a breath rose thin, ragged living. Light discipline, Evan said. No sparks anywhere near the hinge. Lena mirror. She slid a dentist's mirror under the lift ring and angled it until the wire and pin showed together in the small glass like a diagram. Bell on a slip plate. Pin rides a notch here. If we put lateral tension on the hinge plate, the pin will hold even if the bell wire tugs. We need a third hand, Hart said. Shadow lay sphinx still, head leveled at the seam, as if bracing the house with his stare. Evan exhaled, felt the shiver leave his shoulders, and began the methodical work that keeps bad nights from breaking. He slid a folded leather belt under the hinge plate to create backward pressure. Lena eased a thin wedge between the floor and hatch at the corner, away from the bell wire, to lift a hair's breadth. Hard on Evan's count, depressed the spring housing with a flat screwdriver, stealing just enough travel from the pin to keep gravity from winning when the hatch rose. On 3, Evan said, voice barely over the house's own settling. 1, 2, hold. The plate lifted a 1/4 inch. The wire trembled, but didn't sing. A second wedge went in, then a third. The hatch rose to 2 inches, enough to slide fingers through, enough to find the lift ring's weight with the whole of a hand rather than the clumsy strength of fingertips. A breath from below quickened. Someone whispered, or the floorboards learned to speak. Anyone below, listen to me, Evan said into the seam. We are police. We are going to open slowly. There will be light and blankets. If you need us to stop, knock once. If you want us to continue, knock twice. 2 small taps answered one, then another, the tiny arithmetic of hope. Okay, he said mostly to the room, a little to himself. The plate came up silent, the bell wire slack, the pin trapped in its false rest. Dark opened a narrow stair that turned once and dropped into a cellar cut from the earth and skinned in stone air thick with human breath and the stored scent of dirt, potatoes, memory. They went down as they had learned to do, no sudden lights, no rush that breaks trust. Shadow stayed at the hatch lighthouse still. The beam went low, first mapping steps, then widened to name faces a little at a time. 14 women wrapped in blankets that had learned the shape of waiting blinked at the dim, their pupils slow to open. The floor had been trimmed with pallets and woven with throw rugs to blunt the cold. Buckets, water jugs. A shelf of tinned food lined like soldiers. A hand-drawn calendar marked with hatch scratches and 3 small stars placed in a diagonal on last night's square. Up, Evan said, as he always said. Warm, quiet. Doctors, one at a time. Hands reached, some steady, some shaking. Lena's forearm became a railing, then a bridge. Hart took the first 2 at the turn where knees like to betray a climber. A medic waited at the top with wool and water and a voice tuned for steadying. The house cooperated. Floorboards that had threatened to squeal under their earlier weight now behaved as if the building had decided to play its part in the rescuing. On the 7th climber, the house flickered, power cutting and surging as a farm generator hiccuped awake outside. The bell wire quivered in the seam and sang just once, a single bright note like a coin dropped on enamel. Everyone froze. The note died without echo. Evan pictured the bar in its cradle, imagined what would happen if the pin fell, wood split, weight trapped, the way out narrowed to panic. He met Lena's eyes and read the same schematic. "We keep the load smooth," he whispered. No bounce on the stair. They finished the climb the way you recite a prayer you've known since childhood, measured faithful without theater. 14 up, 14 counted twice. On the porch, daylight had thinned to rose. The med tent breathed warm air into the snow and painted the drifts in pink. Blankets rose and fell with the evening lungs of rescued people. Tea steamed. A laugh broke and then became crying, and then became breath again, the kind of breath that belongs to tomorrow. Hart stood in the yard with his notebook and watched the med team's head count match his own. His pencil paused at the bottom of the list. 79, he said softly. Not a cheer, not a sigh. A measurement. We're at 79. The federal convoy crested the lane as the last light left the field. No blare, no sirens, trucks that knew their jobs and wore them without swagger. The case agents took the custody chain as if receiving a lit candle in cupped hands. Victim advocates slid into the tent and translated medical into human and procedure into kindness. A marshal walked the farmhouse with a slow, exacting gaze and nodded once when the bell wire and pin were photographed, labeled bagged. The house relaxed in the way houses do when they're finished keeping a secret and are ready to be only wood and paint again. Evan lingered at the hatch. He rested his palm on the lift plate that had become a door. The wood was cool now, the ghost of warmth gone, but the feeling under his hand stayed a hum made of choices better ones finally. He looked at Shadow, who had not moved from his post until the last pair of feet met the porch. Good Evan said hardly a word at all. Shadow blinked, then yawned in a soft, unceremonious way that made Lena smile even with fatigue sagging her shoulders. They cleared the property by inches and paragraphs, photos, measurements, the quiet arithmetic of bagging evidence that tells a court the truth without rhetoric. When the last signature hit the last form, snow began again, lazy coins of white spinning down out of a sky, ready to erase tracks for the sake of mercy rather than concealment. Back at the station, night bent the halls into the shape of focus. The incident board that had begun as a county map now wore strings like a red web, and sticky notes like a flock of starlings, dates, initials, routes, R6 GW, ONS RT40, and in Hart's print, a single heavy 79 boxed in black. The air smelled like coffee that had been reheated 3 times. Radios murmured low. Somewhere a copier ran out of paper and coughed its protest in a small whine. Shadow made a small circle on the floor by Evan's desk and folded into sleep so fast it felt like a trick paw's tucked muzzle on the crook of a leg. His breathing deepened. In that rhythm, Evan heard 3 days the church steps and steel door, the diner's cooler crib, the mill's dust and dark, the school's pipe-borne tapping the feed warehouse's false floor, the farm's booby-trapped hatch. And he felt briefly the exhaustion he had been refusing long enough to do the work. Across the room, federal leadership briefed next steps with calm that earned its volume, coordinated warrants for properties connected by the manifest slips, subpoenas to chase rental trucks and prepaid phones, a task force to widen the circle beyond county lines. The assistant U.S. attorney used a pen to sketch a new wheel outside the old one. "We'll take the follow-on prosecutions," she said. "Local and state get the credit on the rescues. We've got depth for the long pull." Evan nodded, grateful and restless at once. He studied the board again. 3 X's had turned to clear pins with case numbers. 2 were still red, the far north Barrow Pike Farm, and 1 small mark near the river that had refused to explain itself. Not tonight. Tomorrow. Or the day after. A slow wheel turning the right way for once. He slid a blanket from the back of his chair onto Shadow, who did not wake, just made a sleep noise that sounded like gratitude wearing modesty. The office light flickered and steadied. Hart closed his notebook and rubbed at the ridge the pencil had carved into his finger. Lena leaned back and let her eyes fall shut for the length of a count to 10, then opened them and reached for a fresh sticky note like a runner taking a baton. Evan looked down at the dog, and then at the map, and then at the door, which had a habit of staying open just enough to remind you the world is always walking in. He spoke softly so the words would belong to them, not the room. "We're not finished," he told Shadow. "Not until every red X is checked, erased, or turned into a door that opens the right way." Shadow's ear twitched, an amber pennant flicking in a private breeze. The board waited. The night held. Outside snow made its patient case for a fresh surface, and inside, with 79 counted and the net handed to larger hands, Evan let himself rest barely briefly so he could mean it when morning asked him to move again. They didn't call it a ceremony. People just came. The town hall filled the way. Winter fills a window quietly from the edges inward. Crock-pots clicked warm along a folding table. Aluminum pans fogged their lids, stews rice bread that broke with a soft sigh. Survivors arrived with family hands on their shoulders, with advocates beside them, like steady shadows. The air smelled of cinnamon and wool, and something simpler relief settling into a chair. No speeches. A handful of names, 100 nods. Someone strummed a guitar in the corner and stopped before the second verse, because sound felt better when it left room for breath. Volunteers ferried paper cups and spoons. A nurse changed a bandage with the gentleness you use on a page that's almost dry. Shadow padded through the aisle head level, a blue bandana tied loose at his neck. Children reached and then remembered to ask. He leaned into each small palm as if receiving a secret. A girl with braids and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big approached with a paper held to her chest. Thick crayon letters marched across a sky of yellow and blue. "Thank you for finding us." Beside the words, she had drawn a brown gold dog and a man standing under a moon that colored the snow. "For him," she said. Shadow sniffed the wax and wagged once, slow as a bow. Evan folded to a knee. "We'll keep it safe," he told her, and meant the picture and everything inside it. The girl nodded, then disappeared into the warmth of an aunt's coat. Hart stood by the coffee urn, voice low with federal agents' handoffs. Signed case files already knitting west to east. Lena taped a county map beside the bulletin board and replaced the last red X with clear pins that looked like points of light. No one clapped. They didn't need to. Sometimes mercy is loudest when it doesn't perform. Later, when the trays had emptied and the hall returned to wood and echo, Evan and Shadow walked. Snow had stopped at last. The town shone as if rinsed. St. Mark's rose out of the quiet with its stone scrubbed silver by moonlight. The steps where Shadow had first kept vigil were clean, their edges crisp, each riser a small remembered promise. Evan paused at the north wall where steel hid beneath paint and good intentions. His breath left a brief cloud and vanished. "We'll finish the checks," he said into the cold. It wasn't a vow to the building. It was to the street, to the map, to the names he couldn't know yet. Shadow flicked an ear as if to say, "I already planned on it." They crossed the nave of dark like swimmers under glass. A plow hummed in the distance, brushing the night into order. Somewhere a light went out in an upstairs room. Somewhere else a kettle clicked. At the foot of the old steps, Shadow stopped. He faced the door that had once pretended to be only a door. Ears up, body quiet. The posture of a guardian waiting for the next true thing. Evan stood beside him until the cold began to bite and the stars fenced the sky back into its wide, good shape. They turned for home. Behind them, the church watched clean in the moon. Ahead, the map waited, fewer marks now, but never none. The dog walked close, shoulder brushing his leg as if to remind him that peace isn't a place. It's a practice you keep.